making change happen is challenging for most organizations. They often talk about change, but change often doesn't really happen and doesn't really take place. And especially when we now talk about having a culture of inclusion, how many organizations do you know who all talk about inclusion, diversity, and bring your whole self to work? And when you look into reality, it is still a quite different reality from what most organizations claim on their website. And I have an international expert and keynote speaker here today with me. Hello and welcome, Joanne Lockwood.
Hello. Thank you so much for bringing me on and inviting me to talk today.
Thank you very much for taking the time. And I'm getting straight into the topic. On your website, seechangehappen.co.uk, there's a really good line when you open it where it says, how can we help you embrace a culture of inclusion? And that is a really brilliant line, because many people say, we had this change program where we say we want to be more inclusive. So we did trainings and workshops and coachings. And after that, pretty much not much, maybe a bit changed, but not much. And after 6 months, it all looked a bit like we were where we are before. So what did these organizations do wrong that they tried to change, but they failed to do so when it comes to diversity and inclusion?
I think often the mistake organizations make is they think there's a quick fix. They think that they can hire their way into a new culture. They can make strategic appointments. But often what they don't do is bring the hearts and minds of the people. They don't nurture that inclusion type ethos amongst the leadership team. And I'm a great believer that inclusive leadership is the key to building inclusive cultures. And that's at all levels, even down to being a leader of yourself, personal leadership values. So I think that's where organizations make a mistake. They don't invest heavily enough in the personal and career development of individuals to lead teams effectively and bring people together.
Mm-hmm. So when we now look into, as you said, the personal approach and valuing this change, when we look into reality, and I'm now talking about a case which happened in February 2021, Bill Michael, chairman of KPMG, had to resign after first telling people to stop moaning about COVID-19 and everything connected with it, and also stating that unconscious bias doesn't exist. He had to, I don't know if he had to step down. He stepped down a couple of days later. I think that the supervisory board might have offered him that way out instead of removing him. But how do we want to change when in February 2021, a senior leader of an international consultancy company, they are connected to the most important FTSE 100 companies, all the leading companies, and the CEO, a chairman of that organization, says, oh, come on, unconscious bias, all that, it just doesn't exist.
I think we have to recognize that there are many people in leadership roles, in these senior leadership roles in big organizations that are from a previous generation, a previous era. They've grown up in their privileged environment. They network, they hang out in their clubs with people like them. You know, there's not a lot of diversity of thought going on. And so their rose-tinted view of their organization, of the world. And we're obviously familiar with that. There's a bias that almost one of the biases we have is that we think we're not as biased as other people. So it's quite clear that this person themselves believed that they could overcome their unconscious biases by believing that they were intelligent enough to know when they were being biased and could mitigate it. So I think that is the challenge where, as I say, people of a certain generation, people of a certain class or privilege, hang around in echo chambers, not really in touch with the reality of the shop floor, the workers, the real culture in their organization. Because everywhere they go, everyone's always nervous. Everyone's always sort of like looking up to them. So their view of the world isn't the same as the average employee. And we look at the pay gaps, we look at the culture gaps between the C-suite and the junior people in the organizations, and it's enormous. So I can quite believe the disconnect. And we look at our own, in the UK, our own royal family. We look at someone like the recently deceased Prince Philip, and the language he used to use to describe people. And that was quite common in the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s. And only in the last maybe 10 to 15 years has that language become less acceptable. But when you've lived in that world for so long, it's really hard to adapt. And not only do you mention the person you mentioned there had to resign. We also had the chairman of our football association also use, I would say, clumsy language to describe black people, people of color. He used language that was kind of common 20, 30 years ago. And of course, what these people do is they've never been picked up. They've never engaged with people who think and talk differently. So therefore they never retrain their brain into be more inclusive and think about the language they use.
Can we let people off the hook with the excuse to say, I just come from a different generation? Because to me, it just sounds like people say, I am who I am, get along with it. And then they are very upset when they suddenly have to resign. And of course, the next question connected to it. First question is, can we let them off the hook with that excuse? Second question is, when I just remove them and hire younger people, is that the solution to the problem?
Now, I'm a great believer that education is the key. And certainly we should not let people off the hook. Whether we should vilify them is a debatable topic. Whether if that person is open to education, it becomes accountable for that impact, then I think there's room for rehabilitation. But yeah, sometimes the damage is done.
Fully agree.
I don't think simply removing somebody and replacing them with a younger person is necessarily going to fix the culture problem, because who is that younger person? Are they truly coming from a different background, or are they a protege of the current incumbents? And so it's not an easy equation to say, yes, get rid of that person, put this person in, without understanding who that person would be. But I think there are certain circumstances where you lose the confidence of the board, you lose the confidence of your shareholders, you lose the confidence of your market, at which point your position becomes untenable. In which case, in this particular case, where language is poor, choice of words or beliefs are poor, then at some point that's irrecoverable, I believe, in the same way that politicians, leading figures around the world, they become end of life in that role, and that they need to move on, maybe regroup, like a football manager, 6 months in the wilderness, come back with a new club, having reinvented yourself and being contrite about the mistakes of the past.
Yeah, very good statement, especially when you say that when people are open to education, then I think, and also we know as a value in society, rehabilitation is always an option. Of course, we are a civilized society. When someone does a mistake, they accept it and they get education. Rehabilitation, of course, is the way. This is how civilized societies work. When we now talk about hiring someone else, and especially let's focus on the UK or the US, for example. Let's say we remove someone from a chairman, CEO, leading board position, and then you see who is rehired, especially in the UK now. I can easily guess from which of the top 5, or better to say, top 2 universities they most likely come. Of course, I don't want to hold against someone when they come from a very good university, because excellent education, of course, is the way. However, how do we break the chain that people simply live in their own wealthy family, a great university paid by your family, no tuition fees, nothing bubble, and then suddenly go on top level in free enterprise?
Yeah, I think what you're describing here is kind of like the affinity bias, that people like me, people like us, it's always easier to think about your own image, think about a Kevin-shaped hole that you need to fill, so you're looking for a Kevin. And we make all these preconceived ideas about the type of person that we're looking for based on the people we already have, or we use ourselves as the model. So I think that's the challenge, that when we recruit, we tend to recruit in our own image. And when I'm working with boards on their diversity program, it's a real uphill battle sometimes to get them to put the CV to one side and look for objective-based questions as the guide as to their value and fit in the organization. And we too often rely on, as you said, particular universities, Russell Group, Red Brick in the UK, we're looking for certain organizations. You've worked for one of the big 4 firms, and then you're always going to get a job because you've worked for somebody. And that really prejudges, you could have been a bad player in that organization, but you've still got, as you say, a big 4 accountancy firm on your CV, therefore you can't be all bad. And I think that's the struggle sometimes. We latch on the halo bias, we latch onto the affinity, we latch onto people's CVs quite quickly. And I see a huge barrier to organizations saying, ditch the CV. Let's really go into this blind and try and look at the person as an individual, their capability. And again, a CV is an historical document. What we're looking for is the capability, the learning potential, the adaptability, what they're going to do for you in that role. And we all know that you can train skills, but what you can't always train is personality, attitude, and that learning ability. So if we think about people coming into a role, how often do we hear they've got to hit the ground running? They need to have had so much experience because I want the person to hit the ground running and fit straight in. But we know the reality in any organization, there's a 3 to 6 month onboarding period where you get to know the culture, you get to know the organization, you get to know the processes. In that time, everyone is having to come up to speed themselves. And in that time, we can train those skills where they're deficient, provided the person's got the aptitude and the passion and the drive for that role.
Excellent. So when now people listen to this podcast, they might think this is exactly the problem we have. We need to change. I want to do something. And as you talked about the uphill battle, what should people do who listen to this podcast now and then think, I want to change something, but I'm not in charge of this organization. I'm somewhere in mediocre middle management, maybe team lead, but not anything higher. No fancy CV, as you just said, still a big problem that people look at the CV. So what can people do when they want to embrace change and ignite change in their organization, but they are not sitting in either senior management or board level?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And it's easy for me to be idealistic. It's easy for me to paint a picture of perfect. And in a perfect world, the organization would have a mentor program. Maybe you have a senior manager, senior leader as a mentor that you had access to. But the reality is most people don't have that option. So I would say what you can do is use staff networks, employee resource groups to build a momentum of the LGBT community, the female networks, the Black networks, and then come together as a network of networks to try and influence change that way. Networking within your organization. But fundamentally, what I often say to people is if your organization won't change, doesn't want to change, and is stuck, you have the opportunity to either put up with that or vote with your feet, vote with your career, and say, actually, there are organizations out there that I can move to who are meeting my values. So almost, I would say is in some respects, again, it's a privileged comment that I make. Think about your opportunities here. Is it the right organization for you? And we look at coming out of COVID, we look at the way that many organizations have treated their staff over the last 12 to 18 months. We look at the way that organizations are now treating the staff in this next phase about re-onboarding people, taking people back to the office, not considering people's mental health. And there are a lot of organizations now that are now reflecting on the fact they haven't been treating their people with the respect they deserve. So again, I think that people are going to vote with their feet where organizations aren't talking and involving the staff. So this is a kind of an opportunity for people power. So if you can't bring change, no matter what you do in your organization, vote exit, if you like, and then look at other opportunities. But yeah, that is a privileged position I'm talking about here. Many people don't have that opportunity, or they're not secure enough in their career, or at a level where they don't feel comfortable doing that. So yeah, you have to, for your own mental health, you have to decide what you can do, how you can network, how you can influence, step up the ladder slowly, but try and bring change, bring consensus, get involved with projects within the organization, either voluntarily or maybe community projects that the organization is doing, to create a voice, or find people who are already doing that and say, can I help you? Can I join your voice? Is there something I can do? So yeah, self-empowerment is one way. But again, I appreciate that's a privilege. My lens says I would do that. But many people don't necessarily have the confidence or the social power within an organization to do that.
Excellent. This is excellent advice. Very thoughtful. Thank you very much for that. One last question to round this interview up. when I prepared our interview, I thought of an email and contacted someone who contacted me before a couple of weeks ago, someone who is on a reasonably senior leadership level. And he contacted me due to a podcast I did a couple of months ago and said he now looks at diversity. He realizes that he has done it really wrong. He wants to change, but he is now 56 and he really doesn't know where to start because he thinks he lives in a very privileged situation. He openly says that he is in a good life situation and he has no friends or contacts in any other society contact. So, and he's very afraid of opening up in his organization because he fears when he opens up about being unable to satisfy the diversity needs, then he will see consequences which damages his career in the last 10 years he's now starting for. So what kind of advice would you give to a person who now sees there is something I really missed out on? I have to change. I want to change, but I just don't know where to start.
To your unnamed listener who contacted you and wrote to you, I myself am 56 years old. I embarked on this phase of my life journey about 4 and a bit years ago. So I'm a latecomer to this party as well. I lived a privileged white male life for 40 to 50 years of my life. And I certainly didn't give a lot of thought to inclusion, diversity. I had obviously an epiphany when I made my own gender transition. Obviously, losing one's privilege overnight gives you a different perspective, which inspired me to do it. But if the person you're talking about here, as I think we would call it woken up to the need to be more modern in their thinking. There are lots of ways of doing this. If you browse LinkedIn, you'll see lots and lots of D&I conferences. You'll see lots and lots of people running workshops. You'll be able to listen to panel discussions. I mean, I was on one today with the CIPD in London. There are networks out there where you can sit in and listen to the lived experience of people who are Black, Asian, trans, LGBT, menopause, whatever it may be. Mental health. So I think combine that with YouTube, combine that with Twitter, combine that with LinkedIn, combine that with Facebook. There are so many sources of learning and education that everybody can say, I'm going to spend some time investing in myself, growing my knowledge. And then through basic networking, again, LinkedIn's a great place, connect with people who are in the space and say, can we have a coffee chat? I'd like to find out more about your passion, your cause. And I'm not talking about stalking people or being overly invasive, but if someone's a professional in the D&I space, most of the time they'd be more than willing to have a conversation, especially if there's an opportunity for maybe business or networking there for them to spread that knowledge. So I don't think I think people should embrace that opportunity for enrichment, for self-purpose. And also, if you're thinking about it in your local community, where you live, are they looking for volunteers for rough sleepers, for food banks, for community groups, for whatever? There's a whole load of ways you can get involved in local communities. And it's about trying to create a wider network of contacts beyond the people like you. If your network is mainly people like you, then this is the opportunity to spread your wings and educate yourself.
Excellent. I think these are perfect final words for the podcast. There was lots of great advice from you. Thank you very much for that. Also, I want to point all our listeners to seechangehappen.co.uk. That's Joanne's website, an excellent website, which very specifically also tells you how Joanne can help you. A very good website as well. And I hardly ever see great websites. So I really want to point that one out. Very well done. So at the end of this podcast, after all this great advice, there's only one thing for me left to say. Joanne, thank you very much for your time.
Niels, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for inviting me on.